Belgium, January 7, 1945. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery stands before a room full of reporters at his headquarters and holds court for nearly an hour. He speaks without notes. 3 weeks earlier, Germany's Ardennes offensive had punched a 60-mile gap in American lines. The Battle of the Bulge, the largest German assault on the Western Front since 1940. Eisenhower, desperate to stabilise the northern shoulder, had temporarily placed 2 American armies under Montgomery's command, the US 1st and the US 9th. Now, with the crisis still unresolved, the reporters' pencils were moving. Montgomery described the situation in precise, measured tones. He had received command of a most interesting position. He had organised things, restored order, fought alongside his great and loyal American comrades. He spoke of the crisis as something that had required his particular skills to resolve. The words were courteous on the surface. The framing was something else entirely. Listening to the transcript, every American senior commander understood the implication. Their men had fumbled it, and the British Field Marshal had come down from Brussels to sort them out. Omar Bradley heard the transcript. His response, by multiple accounts, was unprintable. General George Patton had already written in his diary that he wouldn't serve under Montgomery, adding that he doubted Bradley would either. But the most consequential reaction came from Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander. He communicated to General George Marshall in Washington that he would rather resign his command than continue working with Field Marshal Montgomery in it. Montgomery's own Chief of Staff, General Freddie de Guingand, had to fly urgently to his commander's headquarters and explain in plain terms what the next 48 hours would look like if a conciliatory message wasn't sent immediately. Montgomery wrote one. The crisis passed, barely, and with lasting damage. The most celebrated British general of the Second World War had nearly ended his career not against a German tank, not at a conference table, but standing in front of a microphone and letting his ego speak. That fact is the best possible introduction to the man behind the legend, because it captures the essential contradiction that runs through his entire career. A commander of genuine organisational talent and real battlefield achievement, who constructed a myth around himself that the evidence does not fully support. Serving a nation that needed the myth so desperately, it never asked whether it was true. By August 1942, Britain had been losing with grim consistency for 26 months. The strategic situation required not just military victory, but a specific kind of public victory. A general the newspapers could celebrate, a battle the ministry could amplify, a name that could anchor British morale through whatever came next. The sequence of defeats had been brutal. At Dunkirk in May and June 1940, approximately 338,000 troops were evacuated from France aboard whatever vessels could reach the beaches. The press called it a miracle of deliverance. Churchill called it a colossal military disaster, which is what it was. An army had been driven into the sea. On February 15, 1942, Singapore fell to Japanese forces. 85,000 British and Commonwealth troops surrendered, the largest military capitulation in British history. Churchill described it later as the worst disaster and largest surrender in British history. The fortress that was supposed to be impregnable had lasted 1 week against a ground assault. June 21, 1942, Rommel took Tobruk. 33,000 Allied troops went into captivity in a single day. Churchill was in Washington with Roosevelt when the news arrived. A parliamentary vote of no confidence followed on his return. One of his closest associates believed at the time that one more major defeat would end Churchill's premiership. That is the political incubator of the Montgomery myth. Churchill's political survival was directly tied to an Eighth Army victory. The British Ministry of Information was already running book publishing, newsreels and press management as active propaganda tools. After El Alamein, specific governmental efforts were made to amplify the battle's international significance. The machine for manufacturing a hero was already operational. What it needed was a man on whom the machinery could focus. Montgomery didn't just benefit from that apparatus, he understood it, used it, and fed it material for years. Churchill flew to Cairo in early August 1942. He restructured the Middle East Command, General Harold Alexander as theatre commander, and for the Eighth Army itself, the fighting command, Lieutenant General William Strafer Gott, not Montgomery. Gott was Churchill's personal choice. He was one of the desert's legendary figures, brave to the point of recklessness, and Churchill wanted him. On August 7th, Gott boarded a Bristol-Bombay transport of 216 Squadron to fly back to Cairo. Luftwaffe Me-109 fighters intercepted the aircraft. They shot it down. Then they strafed the wreckage on the ground. Gott was killed. Without those Me-109s over the Western Desert on that afternoon, Bernard Montgomery very probably never commands the Eighth Army. General Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, and Montgomery's long-standing mentor, the man who had championed his career through the interwar years at the Staff College at Camberley, had been pressing for Montgomery for months. Churchill's energy had been directed elsewhere. Circumstance now delivered Brooke's candidate. Montgomery's appointment, the foundation of his entire legend, was the product of a Luftwaffe interception. He arrived in Egypt mid-August 1942, visited the front on his first day, and ordered Auchinleck's contingency plans for retreat to the Nile Delta destroyed. He told the Eighth Army it would stand and fight at El Alamein. Not withdraw, stand. His directness, his visible confidence, his habit of addressing troops personally and directly, all of it landed hard on an army that had been retreating and losing for months. He also reversed Auchinleck's experiments with combined arms battle groups, reinstating traditional divisional organisation and centralising command decision-making back to army headquarters. The chaos of improvised formations that had served Rommel's faster tempo was dismantled. But here is what the legend consistently obscures: what Montgomery actually walked into. General Claude Auchinleck had been fighting Rommel since June 1942. He had lost to Brooke, and the retreat to the Alamein line had been ugly. But at the First Battle of El Alamein in July 1942, he had stopped Rommel's advance. Not slowed it, stopped it. The defensive line running from the Mediterranean coast to the impassable Qattara Depression was established and fortified. The RAF had achieved air superiority over the Western Desert that it would never again lose. American Sherman tanks were arriving in theatre. Equipment was flowing in at a rate Rommel's strangled supply lines couldn't match. Auchinleck had also made the personnel changes that rebuilt Eighth Army effectiveness before Montgomery arrived. Corelli Barnett, in The Desert Generals, published in 1960, made this case at length. The army Montgomery took over wasn't a broken force. It was a battered one, whose foundations had been laid by the man being shown the door. The most pointed piece of evidence is a document. In late July 1942, Auchinleck's Chief of Staff, Major General Eric Chink Dorman Smith, produced a written strategic appreciation, a formal planning paper, analysing the Eighth Army's situation. The document identified the Halfa ridge as the decisive terrain in the expected next Axis attack. It predicted Rommel would advance along the southern flank, aiming for that ridge. It recommended a static defensive posture there to absorb and defeat the thrust. The appreciation was on paper, dated and filed, before Montgomery's aircraft touched down in Egypt. Ultra-intelligence from Bletchley Park was already confirming what Dorman Smith had assessed. Intelligence historians have been direct on this point. The information conveyed by Ultra to Montgomery only confirmed the planning that Auchinleck had already done independently. The enemy's intentions and the terrain's importance were both known before the new commander arrived. Montgomery reinforced the Halfa ridge. He waited. Rommel attacked on August 30th, along the southern flank, aimed at the ridge, exactly as Dorman Smith had predicted. The attack was funneled into the prepared defence, absorbed heavy losses, and Rommel withdrew by September 5th. The Battle of Halfa was complete. In his memoirs, Montgomery acknowledged Auchinleck's plan of operations, his own phrasing, while framing his own role as the decisive command factor. Barnett's argument was that the position from which Montgomery fought the battle had been designed under Auchinleck. Niall Barr's scholarship in Pendulum of War attributed the defensive framework back even further, to Gott, the dead man Montgomery replaced, who had been developing the Halfa concept in the weeks before the Me-109s caught his transport. The physical reinforcement of the ridge was carried out under Montgomery's orders. The decision to hold that specific ground wasn't his. His failure to counterattack aggressively after Halfa was noted immediately. Critics described it as excessive caution, letting a shattered, fuel-starved Afrika Korps withdraw rather than pressing it to destruction. His defenders called it methodical restraint. What isn't disputed is that after his first victory, Rommel's core fighting strength escaped intact. It was a pattern that would repeat. The Second Battle of El Alamein is the centerpiece of everything. The legend rests on it. The bell ringing rests on it. So the prosecution has to engage with it honestly rather than dismiss it. The guns opened at 9:40 p.m. on October 23, 1942. Between 882 and 908 British artillery pieces fired simultaneously along the El Alamein line. German veterans on the receiving end reportedly recognized it within minutes, the drum fire signature of the Royal Artillery in 1918, the massed bombardment that had broken armies on the Western Front. For 4 hours, those guns fired. Behind those guns, 195,000 Allied troops and 1,035 tanks, including 252 American Shermans, fresh from US factories. The Axis forces fielded between 104,000 and 116,000 troops and 547 tanks total. But of those Axis tanks, only approximately 211 were German medium tanks, the Panzer IIIs and IVs, capable of seriously engaging the Shermans. The remainder were lighter Italian armour, significantly inferior in armour and firepower. In effective medium tank strength, the Allied advantage was roughly 4-1. In combat aircraft, the Allies had 730 to 750 against approximately 350 Axis, a 3-1 margin. In anti-tank guns, a 3-1 Allied advantage. Rommel had additional problems the numbers don't fully capture. He had flown to Germany in September to recover from illness and wasn't at his headquarters when the battle opened. His temporary replacement, General Georg Stummer, a competent officer the troops nicknamed Fireball for his permanently flushed complexion, drove toward the front lines on October 24th to assess the chaos of the first night's fighting. His car came under fire. The driver was shot in the head. Stummer jumped out to take cover, suffered a heart attack, and died without ever being struck by a bullet. For the critical opening 24 to 36 hours, while the battle's first phase was determining whether the Axis line would hold at all, the Panzer Army had no permanent commander. Rommel was ordered back to Africa. He arrived on October 25th to find the situation already unravelling. Axis supply lines had been systematically strangled by British naval and air interdiction for months. Hitler issued his victory or death hold order, commanding no withdrawal. Rommel obeyed the order past the point where any rational military calculus would have justified it, continuing to feed men into positions that couldn't be held, hemorrhaging irreplaceable veteran soldiers for hours beyond the moment when withdrawal was the only rational course. Montgomery adjusted during the battle when his initial plan stalled. The pivot from the failed northern breakthrough to the supercharge operation against the Axis centre was competent command thinking under pressure. His apologists are correct about that. The battle wasn't fought on rails. The 9th Armoured Brigade was ordered on November 2nd to charge directly into a line of Axis anti-tank guns at dawn, their tanks silhouetted against the rising sun. Lieutenant General Bernard Freyberg of the 2nd New Zealand Division, whose formation was leading supercharge, noted beforehand that sending armour directly at a wall of guns sounded like another balaclava. He wasn't wrong. The brigade went from 94 operational tanks to 14 in a single action. The brigade commander was found sleeping on a stretcher beside the wreckage when another officer came looking for his armoured regiments. The officer asked where they were. The brigadier waved at the tanks around him. "There they are." He was indicating the survivors. The battle ended in Allied breakthrough. Rommel disobeyed Hitler's hold order on November 4th and authorised general withdrawal. Churchill spoke at the Mansion House on November 10th, the day before the last Axis troops cleared Egyptian territory. "Now this isn't the end," he told his audience. "It isn't even the beginning of the end. But it's perhaps the end of the beginning." He was right. El Alamein and the Anglo-American torch landings in northwest Africa on November 8th together marked a strategic turning point that the war never reversed. Allied casualties: 13,500 total, approximately 4,800 dead, from 195,000 engaged troops. Axis: by the best supported accounting, approximately 54,000 total casualties, killed, wounded and captured, from a force of roughly 110,000 to 116,000. The Panzerarmee's casualty rate ran to approximately 45 to 50%. The 8th Armies ran to roughly 7%. The prosecution's question isn't whether the victory mattered. It did. The question is what specific genius was required to achieve it. Facing a 4-to-1 effective tank disadvantage, a 3-to-1 air disadvantage, a strangled supply situation, a commander dead of a heart attack on day 2, and a Hitler-issued stand-fast order that prevented rational withdrawal. What tactical innovation was actually necessary? The honest answer is competent attritional management of overwhelming material superiority. Montgomery supplied the competence. The United States supplied the Shermans. The Royal Navy supplied the strangled supply lines. Bletchley Park supplied the intelligence. The morale transformation was real. The artillery technique, the preparation, the refusal to commit before conditions were set, these were genuine contributions from a genuine professional. But the genius claim, The idea that Alamein demonstrated tactical brilliance of the First Order is the most inflated piece of the legend. Churchill himself, who understood what he was dealing with, described Montgomery as a great artillerist who believed that cannons kill men and always sought to bring 3 or 4 guns to bear for every one of the enemies. That is a description of method, not genius. On November 4th, 1942, the breakthrough was achieved. For the next 3 days, Montgomery organised his pursuit. 3 days. Rommel's force was broken, running on fumes, critically short of fuel after months of interdiction. The Africa Corps in the immediate aftermath of El Alamein was as vulnerable as it would ever be. Units separated, communications disrupted, vehicles abandoned, the road west clogged with the detritus of defeat. 3 days of pursuit organisation allowed German rearguards to establish positions that would slow the chase for the rest of the campaign. Approximately 20,000 German troops escaped the El Alamein encirclement. Montgomery had written in terms suggesting total destruction of the enemy, that none escaped. The Africa Corps retreated 1,100 miles from El Alamein across Libya to Tunisia, reaching El Agheila and beyond with enough coherence to continue fighting. The Italian formations were largely captured. The German corps, the experienced officers, the trained tank crews, the operational veterans made it out. Those men fought in Tunisia until May 1943. 6 more months of campaigning that cost additional Allied lives. The logistics defence, that the 8th Army's supply lines were genuinely stretched after 12 days of intensive fighting, has merit. But the 3-day organisational delay before pursuit even began, before the chase started, before any force was pressing the broken enemy westward, isn't explained by logistics. Rommel's memoir, Rommel's own accounts of the retreat, described the Africa Corps moving as fast as its fuel allowed, with no serious British pressure on its heels for days. The pattern was established. The battle won, the enemy permitted to escape intact enough to fight again. While the 8th Army rebuilt through the winter of 1942 to 43, Montgomery was constructing something else with equal deliberateness. The Black Beret wasn't an accident. He adopted the Royal Tank Regiment beret, non-standard dress for a general of infantry background, and attached 2 cap badges, the RTR badge and later the 8th Army's own badge. No other senior commander in the British Army wore anything like it. When any cluster of khaki uniforms appeared at any position, there was a single, immediately recognisable silhouette that stood apart from every other figure. Photographers knew exactly where to point their cameras. Press access to the 8th Army commander was actively managed. Photographic requests were made at his level and General Dempsey's, indicating deliberate control of visual coverage rather than passive tolerance of press interest. He wore plain battle dress visiting troops, not the braided formality of a general's dress uniform. He spoke directly to soldiers, not through intermediaries. He toured units personally, stopped, talked, was visible. Soldiers called him Monty. The emotional transaction was calculated to the last detail. The commander as one of them, accessible, present, confident, while the propagandistic apparatus ensured those images and stories circulated as widely as possible through the British press. Nigel Hamilton's sympathetic 3-volume biography, the closest thing to an official life of Montgomery, documents the image cultivation in detail while defending the battlefield record. Even Hamilton concedes the construction was deliberate. The black beret with 2 badges, the plain battle dress, the personal visits, none of it was spontaneous. It was the work of a man who understood that the story told about a commander matters as much as the operations he conducts, and who was determined to control both. His 1958 memoirs completed the project, and in doing so, destroyed the most durable friendship the war had left him. Eisenhower had endured Montgomery's insubordination, his condescension toward American commanders, his constant demands for overall ground command, his arrogance, and his press conferences for 13 years. The memoirs made specific strategic claims about the war and about Eisenhower's conduct that Eisenhower considered a fundamental betrayal. The friendship ended permanently. Montgomery's self-image, it turned out, was non-negotiable, not even at the cost of the man who had protected his career most consistently and most patiently through the war's final year. By January 1944, Montgomery had left the Eighth Army and was in England helping plan the Normandy invasion. On June 6th, he commanded all Allied ground forces during the initial Overlord landings. The landings succeeded. What followed was more complicated. Operations around Caen through June and July 1944 failed repeatedly to achieve their stated objectives on schedule. Montgomery's defenders argued that the true plan was always to use the British sector as a hinge, drawing German armour east toward Caen while American forces broke out to the west, and that the Caen operations were deliberate holding actions. His critics, including Carlo d'Este in Decision in Normandy, argued that Montgomery's own stated objectives for Caen weren't achieved, and that he subsequently rewrote his operational intentions to claim the attritional grinding had been his design all along. By July 1944, Churchill had reportedly lost patience with his progress. Then came the Falaise pocket, and the second large-scale escape of German forces under Montgomery's watch. By mid-August 1944, Allied forces had the opportunity to encircle the bulk of German Army Group B in Normandy. The southern jaw of the encirclement, under Patton's Third Army, swung up from the south. The northern jaw, under 1st Canadian Army, as part of Montgomery's 21st Army Group, was supposed to close from the north around Falaise. The gap between the two jaws, the Falaise Gap, had to be sealed before the Germans could extract their forces. The 1st Canadian Army's advance on the northern jaw was slow. The gap stayed open longer than it needed to. Tens of thousands of German soldiers escaped through it, experienced veterans who had been fighting since Normandy, carrying whatever equipment and weapons they could move. Carlo d'Este's detailed reconstruction of the decision-making documented the failures on the northern jaw with meticulous sourcing. Omar Bradley, in A Soldier's Story, expressed his frustration with the pace of the encirclement's closure. The Germans who escaped through Falaise didn't disappear. They reappeared. At Arnhem in September 1944, in the Ardennes in December 1944, in the winter fighting along the Rhine that extended the war through the spring of 1945. The long tail of the Falaise escape reached across the last 8 months of the war in northwest Europe, and it traced back to the northern jaw of an encirclement that moved too slowly. On September 1st, 1944, Eisenhower assumed direct operational command of all Allied ground forces in northwest Europe. Montgomery kept 21st Army Group, but was no longer the theatre land forces commander. He understood exactly what the change meant, and he never fully accepted it. What he did in the following 10 days is the defining paradox of his career. The man who had demanded overwhelming force before any engagement, who had reorganized 2 armies before committing them, who had been criticized from the Western Desert to Normandy for excessive caution, that man proposed Operation Market Garden. He pressed it on Eisenhower on September 10th, flying to Brussels to meet the Supreme Commander at the airfield, reportedly insistent in a way that colleagues found unusually aggressive even by Montgomery's standards. Eisenhower, described at the time as unwell, agreed to the plan. He authorised it with a promise of 1,000 additional tons of daily supplies and described himself, at the time, as an ardent supporter of the operation. Montgomery's strategic argument was that a single powerful thrust across the Rhine, backed by all available Allied resources, could end the war by Christmas 1944. Against Eisenhower's broad front strategy, advancing across a wide front to keep pressure on the entire German line, Montgomery argued for concentration, for a single knife thrust at Germany's heart. Market Garden was that thrust. Scholars examining Montgomery's advocacy for the plan have noted that his motivation mixed genuine strategic conviction with something personal. The September 1st demotion had stripped him of theatre ground command. Market Garden was a means of reasserting relevance, of demonstrating that his operational vision was superior to Eisenhower's caution. The desire for personal and professional vindication appears alongside the strategic argument in the record. Whatever the balance of motives, on September 17, 1944, 1,534 transport aircraft and nearly 500 gliders carrying 3 airborne divisions lifted off for the Netherlands. It was the largest airborne operation in the history of warfare. The intelligence warnings arrived before the drop. Major Brian Urquhart was the G2, the intelligence officer of 1st British Airborne Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Frederick Boy Browning. On September 15, 1944, 2 days before Market Garden launched, Urquhart was working through photographic reconnaissance imagery and reports from the Dutch underground. He found what he was looking for, and what he was looking for was exactly what nobody in the planning process wanted to find. The 9th SS Panzer Division and the 10th SS Panzer Division, 2nd SS Panzer Corps, were refitting in the Arnhem area. Their vehicles appeared on the reconnaissance photographs. The Dutch underground had been reporting the same. Urquhart brought his findings to Browning. He presented the photographic evidence of SS armoured vehicles positioned within the 1st Airborne Division's planned operational area. Browning dismissed the warning. His response, as recorded in the historical accounts, he wouldn't trouble himself about the panzer threat. The photographs showed a small number of tanks. The plan continued unchanged. On September 16th, the day before the operation launched, ultra-decrypts confirmed the movement of both the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions in the Nijmegen and Arnhem area. The information reached higher headquarters. No changes were made. A US Army analysis produced years later stated the conclusion plainly. Operation Market Garden wasn't an intelligence failure. The intelligence was gathered, it was assessed, it was formally presented to commanders, it was dismissed. What failed wasn't the intelligence apparatus, it was the command judgment of the men who received the warnings and chose not to act on them. The distinction matters because it places the responsibility precisely where it belongs. The plan itself had additional weaknesses that owed nothing to the Germans. The 1st Airborne Division's designated drop zones were 6 to 8 miles from the Arnhem Bridge they needed to capture. A planning decision made because of concerns about anti-aircraft defences near closer landing zones. 6 to 8 miles, on foot, through Dutch streets, in daylight, against an enemy that would have hours to react before the first paratrooper reached the objective. The radios issued to the Division for Internal Communications were tuned to frequencies that didn't function properly in the terrain. Units that landed miles apart couldn't speak to each other. Divisional headquarters couldn't communicate with brigade commanders. The 1st Airborne dropped into a communications blackout. 10th Corps' armoured column was supposed to drive 60 miles up a single elevated highway. Hell's Highway, the Dutch called it almost immediately, from its start line to Arnhem in roughly 48 hours. The highway ran through flat, marshy terrain where tanks couldn't easily leave the road. German infantry on either side with anti-tank weapons could, and repeatedly did, cut the column's route. The advance fell behind schedule from the first day. At Arnhem Bridge itself, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Parachute Battalion reached the northern end of the bridge and held it. They held it for 4 days against the 9th SS Panzer Division, a formation equipped with tanks and armoured infantry against British paratroopers carrying light weapons, with no artillery support, no armoured backup, and no realistic prospect of relief. The fighting was close and savage, buildings taken room by room, ammunition running down, casualties mounting by the hour. By September 21st, the last defenders on the northern end of the bridge were overwhelmed. Frost was wounded and taken prisoner. On September 25th, the operation officially ended. Approximately 2,000 survivors of the 1st Airborne Division were evacuated back across the Rhine. The Imperial War Museums confirmed figures for the operation. 1,485 British and Polish airborne troops killed or died of wounds. 6,525 more became prisoners of war. The Glider Pilot Regiment alone lost 219 killed and 511 captured. From approximately 10,000 who had dropped or landed near Arnhem, fewer than 2,000 got home. Montgomery's public response was to claim the operation was 90% successful, because Allied forces had captured 90% of the planned route. He attributed the failure to Eisenhower's supply allocation, arguing that insufficient resources had been directed to the operation. The man who had conceived and championed Market Garden, who had pressed it personally on a supreme commander in a Brussels airfield meeting, who had sold it as potentially ending the war, now pointed at supply lines. George Patton, whose Third Army operations had been deliberately starved of supplies to fund Montgomery's operation, reportedly found cold comfort in the knowledge of what those diverted resources had purchased. The events of January 1945 in Belgium are the last piece of the prosecution's case, and in some ways the most revealing. Eisenhower had placed Montgomery in temporary command of US 1st and 9th Armies to manage the northern shoulder of the Bulge. Montgomery genuinely helped stabilise the situation. British and American troops worked together under his command during some of the hardest winter fighting of the war. The tactical contribution was real. But Montgomery hadn't simply wanted to manage the northern shoulder. He had wanted the Bulge crisis to demonstrate something larger, that Eisenhower's broad front strategy was fundamentally flawed, and that a single commander, himself, needed to take overall control of all Allied ground forces. He raised the issue again in December 1944, pressing Eisenhower once more for the supreme ground command he had been refused repeatedly since September 1st. Eisenhower refused again. The January 7th press conference was the explosion that followed. Montgomery stood in front of the reporters and described the Battle of the Bulge as an interesting problem he had been handed to solve. He spoke of the Americans as great soldiers who fought magnificently once they had been properly organised. The framing, that the Americans had needed organisation, that the British Field Marshal had provided it, that the crisis had required his specific intervention, was unmistakable to every American senior officer who read the transcript. Bradley's authorised response 2 days later, on January 9th, was described at the time as completely unauthorised and openly anti-Montgomery. Bradley made clear he had no desire for continued British command of American forces, and considered Montgomery's account of events fundamentally inaccurate. Eisenhower went further. He communicated to General Marshall in Washington that he would resign rather than continue if Montgomery remained in command. Marshall, who understood the political dimensions of losing Eisenhower from the European theatre, made clear that any such communication would force the combined chiefs to choose between the two men. Montgomery's chief of staff, de Guingand, flew to Montgomery's headquarters and laid out the situation with uncharacteristic bluntness. Montgomery sent a conciliatory letter to Eisenhower. The crisis was diffused. Patton's diary documented his contempt in terms that left no ambiguity. Bradley's memoirs, A Soldier's Story and A General's Life, contain extensive accounts of specific episodes of Montgomery's interference, condescension, and manipulation. British officers serving at Eisenhower's Scharfe headquarters documented his aggressively hostile attitude toward them. Contempt for any British officer who served the Allied Supreme Command rather than under him personally. Montgomery's arrogance had not merely damaged relationships at the senior level. It had penetrated the command structure itself, turning the coordination of men fighting the same enemy into an exercise in constant diplomatic management. The accumulated Allied friction had operational consequences. Time spent managing Montgomery's demands for overall ground command was time the Supreme Allied Commander spent not managing the war. Energy consumed by the January 1945 crisis was energy not directed at German armour. The ego wasn't merely an eccentricity, it was a strategic liability, and it was consistently treated as one by the men who had to work around it. The fraud charge, as a single total verdict, is too blunt an instrument for the evidence. Montgomery wasn't fabricating victories from nothing. He was a genuine organizer, a real morale builder, a competent commander of attritional set-piece warfare, who transformed a demoralized army and delivered the first major British land victory against Germany in the Second World War. El Alamein was the turning point. Churchill named it. The church bells rang for a reason. But the legend the bells were celebrating was already larger than the man behind it. Halfa was substantially Dorman Smith and Auchinleck's architecture, confirmed by intelligence systems they had built, implemented well by a general who gave credit for none of it in his memoirs. El Alamein was an attritional victory, bought with a 4-to-1 effective tank advantage, 3-to-1 air superiority, strangled enemy logistics, a dead enemy deputy commander, and an ultra-intelligence apparatus that had preceded Montgomery's arrival in theatre. The 3-day pursuit delay let 20,000 Germans escape to fight for 6 more months. The Falaise Gap let German veterans escape to Arnhem and the Ardennes. Market Garden killed or captured more than 8,000 British and Polish airborne soldiers who had been sent in on Montgomery's insistence, with intelligence warnings his own corps commander dismissed, against SS Panzer divisions that Ultra had confirmed were in position 2 days before the drop. Corelli Barnett made the scholarly case against the legend in The Desert Generals in 1960, crediting Auchinleck and Dorman Smith with the framework Montgomery was given credit for winning. Carlo d'Este's decision in Normandy prosecuted the Normandy record with sourced precision. Nigel Hamilton's 3-volume sympathetic biography concedes the arrogance and its damage to Allied cohesion, while defending the battlefield competence. The historical balance runs between those positions. A genuine professional whose real achievements were amplified beyond recognition by his own relentless self-promotion. By a government propaganda apparatus that needed a hero. And by a British public bent down by years of defeat that couldn't afford to look too closely at what it was celebrating. Britain made Montgomery into what it needed. Montgomery stepped into that role with both feet and held the pose for the rest of his life. The self-constructed legend served a genuine national psychological need in 1942. It served Montgomery's personal ambition from 1942 until his death in 1976. It cost Auchinleck and Dorman Smith the credit for work they had done. It cost the 1st Airborne Division its existence at Arnhem. It cost the Allied command structure years of diplomatic damage that slowed decisions and fractured relationships at critical moments in the war. The question that the Black Beret, the press conferences, and the 1958 memoirs can never quite answer is how many of those costs were necessary. How many men died in 6 months of Tunisian fighting because Montgomery took 3 days to organize a pursuit of a broken enemy? How many died at Arnhem because the cautious general needed to win a strategic argument with his supreme commander? How many were lost in the Ardennes, fighting men who had escaped through the Falaise gap? History doesn't provide clean counterfactuals, but it does provide ledgers, and Montgomery's ledger, read in full rather than in the edited version he spent his career constructing, contains entries the legend was never designed to acknowledge. Subscribe for more stories like this.